Shaun Tabatt coming to you from NRB 2021. Excited to sit down with Voddie Baucham, who, man, I've been following for many years. I got 10 kids, part of the homeschooling movement, and you've been a mainstay content-wise. DVDs, when we had DVDs, books, man, you've been speaking into my life for years. It's good to finally meet you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, brother. Yeah.
And give us a little bit, for somebody who doesn't know you, the funny thing for me, and I talked to you about this a moment ago, in my circles, people are like, this Voddie Baucham guy, have you heard of him? Have you read his book? Like,
Yeah.
I've known of you for years, but for somebody who's meeting you for the first time, give us like that elevator pitch version of your family's journey. What do people need to know about you?
Wow.
Or just who you are.
Yeah, I'm just a kid from South Central LA who was raised by a single teenage Buddhist mother, came to faith in college, heard the gospel for the first time in college, met and married my wife my sophomore year in college, and we had our first child 10 months after that. And
we did that same thing. Yeah. It's easy to remember where your anniversary and that first kid's birthday falls.
Absolutely. So we've been married now 32 years. We have 9 kids. You know, I'm a pastor and professor, and for the last 6 years have been serving as dean of the School of Divinity at African Christian University in Lusaka in Zambia. So my wife and I are there with our 7 youngest children. Have 2 older children here. Have 2 grandkids and another grandkid on the way. But yeah, man, that's me.
We could stop there. That's a great legacy right there. It's an interesting season where God's telling people to move all over the world right now. What did your wife say when you said, "Hey, we got to move to Zambia"? Was she excited, or was she like,
She's
"What?"
the one who said it to me. You know, the Lord called me there 8 years before. It just took a while for her to get the message, and I think she was the one who said, "You know what? We need to do this."
And I think that was one of the things I loved in the book. You talk about going to Zambia and how much that impacted you. What was it like to go to Africa for the first time and just wrestle with that? Man, that was powerful.
It really was powerful. My father died in April of 2006, and my father didn't raise me, but I knew my dad and had a relationship with my dad. He came to faith late in life, and I actually got to mentor him and disciple him, and that last year or so of his life. We didn't know it was the last year or so of his life. And he always wanted to go to Africa, always talked about Africa. He dies in April. My first trip to Africa is in August. And so it was a really powerful experience for me on a personal level, to have that experience. And then on a cultural level, to just, know my family's history and to know that we were brought to America as slaves from that part of the world. It was amazing. And just to think about the fact that all these years later, the Lord's given me the privilege of being, a citizen of the greatest republic in the history of the world, have the greatest, theological education available anywhere, and then to be able to go back there and to be able to pour that out. It was a phenomenal experience.
And let's go back to your growing up years. I mean, statistically, you shouldn't have amounted to anything. There's all the things that should have gone wrong in your life. Obviously, your mom was really hard on you in a good way, but talk to us about how one of the problems with your story is it kind of breaks the narrative.
Yeah, it does in a lot of ways. But, that has to do with a number of things, most of which is my mother and her commitment to me. And, when I got old enough to find a little trouble in LA, my mother shipped me out. I got on a Greyhound bus for 3 days, I guess, and went from Los Angeles, California to Beaufort, South Carolina, and lived with her oldest brother, with my uncle, who was a retired drill instructor in the Marine Corps, who had done 2.5 tours in Vietnam. And I got out of trouble. And it's amazing to me because, I have a sister who's 14 years younger, a brother, my father, who's 20 years younger. It's also really an only child growing up. And the closest person to me was my cousin, Jamal. And I left LA. Jamal didn't leave LA. And when I was a junior in high school, Jamal, he had started selling drugs and he got killed. He was shot to death in Oakland, California, in a drug deal that went bad. And I hadn't come to faith. I hadn't heard the gospel. But that was another powerful moment in my life where I had to go back to Los Angeles to the funeral of my 16-year-old cousin and just recognize that our paths had diverged, that he had stayed and I hadn't. And God really used that a little over a year later in my whole journey to faith.
Let's fast forward into some of your early ministry years. In the book, you talk about wrestling with, what it meant to, do you go to an all black church or the whole, and that was very early on in the diversity discussions, but people weren't sure, should we try to be extra diverse because we're guilty if we don't? And
well, this is also the Promise Keepers movement, the height of the Promise Keepers movement, right? So racial reconciliation was on everybody's lips. And, for me, I was really more of kind of a Black power, Black nationalist, kind of guy. If you think about the influence of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, I was more on the Malcolm X side.
Sure. You had some fantastic T-shirts back in the day.
Man. Even when I was a Christian at Houston Baptist University, because I was playing football at Rice, God calls me to preach. I start preaching. Because I'm playing football, people want to hear what I had to say. And so I figured I needed to learn something. So I left Rice University, went to Houston Baptist University. Immediately my phone stops ringing because people no longer want to hear what I have to say. But, I'm there at HBU sort of wrestling with this whole, is it my racial ethnic identity first, or is it my Christian identity first? And so, at that time, I'm a new believer. I'm training for the ministry, and I'm wearing Malcolm X T-shirts, and not just Malcolm, but the whole Nation of Islam thing, and it was interesting.
Well, I think for a lot of people, the last 2 years have kind of taken them by storm, and they feel like this conversation just started overnight, or it started in Minneapolis with George Floyd. But I think back to all the things I've heard through the years. Those who were speaking in homeschooling circuits, even 15, 20 years ago, was talking about the logical end of the path we are on. Did this, I've implied that it hasn't. Did this just start like a year and a half, 2 years ago, or has this been coming for a long time?
For a long time. I was talking about Gramscian neo-Marxism in 2004, 2005, and watching people's eyes cross.
Why do we need to care?
Yeah, why do we need to care about this? And fast forward now, what we're seeing is really a new manifestation of this Gramscian neo-Marxist ideology. And so critical theory, critical pedagogy, critical legal studies, which then comes to critical race theory, all of these things in that word critical at the beginning of them.
That's a trigger word you should know.
It connects them to the Frankfurt School.
Okay.
And it connects them to Gramsci. And so it says, look at me, I am Marxist, you know. So whenever you see that critical on the beginning of it, which is interesting that now, critical race theory scholars, because there's a backlash against critical race theory, they're coming out saying, no, this is just about studying racism in American history. And, and I'm just sitting here going, no, wait a minute. What's your name? What do you call it, right? Why do you call it critical race theory, which comes out of critical legal studies, which is rooted in critical theory from the Frankfurt School, which is rooted in Antonio Gramsci's ideas, and which is rooted in Karl Marx's ideas. So no, this stuff is not new at all, not by a long shot. It's been in the academy for a long time, but it was in these, sort of obscure fields of study where these echo chambers are writing papers, amongst themselves. And it wasn't until things began to be popularized, really, the people like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi are really popularizing this stuff. And then, also people like, Be the Bridge.
I'm blanking. I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
That's Morrison. Would be a Christian who is, very much promoting critical race theory and very much writing in these themes. And also, you would see it in books like Color of Compromise and, books like this that are written from that perspective by people who are identifying themselves as Christian, but are really about wide awake,
Sure.
I mean, it's just that's Robin DiAngelo, Ibram X. Kendi, critical whiteness studies, critical race theory, just throughout, published by Christian publishers.
Well, and before this interview, I talked to Owen Strand about his new book that's just coming out. And I asked him, like, as a white guy, did you know what you're going to get yourself into jumping into this conversation? But for you, as a black man jumping into this conversation, did it deliver everything you thought it would in terms of good and bad response?
Yeah.
Like, some people are going to love it, some people are going to hate it.
It really did. And, I knew that, the playbook on this is not new at all, right? If a white person speaks to it, you call them a racist. If a black person speaks to it, you say they've internalized racism and you call them coon, Uncle Tom, house Negro, whatever, sellout. And so, but when that happens, in my mind, I immediately go, wait a minute. When people start with argument ad hominem, that means they don't have another argument, right?
It's trying to shut you down.
Yeah, they just, try to shut you down and not deal with the substance of your argument. And so right now we have people, making argument ad hominem, or, there's these red herrings out there and people who are trying to, redefine critical race theory all of a sudden, as though there's not a long, deep literature on this stuff. Or they're trying to create this, fallacy of, it's either critical race theory or you don't care about racism, justice, and so on and so forth. But, my hope with the book was really to help people sift through all of that.
All the voices.
Yeah.
I think one of the more sobering parts of the book, and there are many sobering things to wrestle with in the book, is that this is building, this is going somewhere. This isn't something that's just going to go away. I think a lot of people are trying to be hopeful, like, this is all going to just blow over, right? And you seem to imply in the book that this is definitely moving in a direction and building.
Right. This is about power. And so critical theory, the Frankfurt School, Gramscian Marxism, it is all about problematizing things so that you make the assumption of the oppressor-oppressed categories. And then you make the assumption, Gramsci's assumption, of cultural hegemony, right? The cultural hegemony is the ideology that's being used to keep oppressed people oppressed. And so the critical in critical theory is about how you get into that and recognize these oppressive tools, dismantle them so that you can reverse the power structure. So ultimately, this is about power. This is not just about, hey, let's have a discussion about racism or American history or slavery or whatever. No. This is about reversing the whole idea of who's in power.
Well, another interesting thing that I got out of the book is in terms of, for white folks in this conversation, there is no salvation. Like, you don't ever come out on the other side of this. It's just always a giving up, and giving up, and giving up.
And it's not a conversation. It's not a conversation, and there is no salvation. Because your job as a white person is to shut up and listen, and then do the work of anti-racism, which, by the way, never ends.
Will never arrive. That's not a good place to be. In terms of the gospel, I think that was one of the things I thought all throughout last year, and we saw many prominent leaders jump onto this bandwagon. When did the gospel suddenly become insufficient for dealing with some of these sorts of disagreements in culture? Man. I mean, is it no longer valid? What did we miss?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That the gospel and the law are insufficient, right? And what's amazing is that there are a lot of people who didn't want to have anything to do with law before,
right?
And now all of a sudden they're law,
all about it.
But it's a different law,
right?
And so the scripture's not sufficient. The gospel's not sufficient. We need things like critical race theory in order for us to be able to think rightly about the relationship between groups of people. That's blasphemy, man. Mm-hmm. Pure and simple.
Well, another thing I loved in how you set up the book is that you talk about how this is really a religion with priests and commandments and all the things. And so if you had to kind of summarize how it operates or functions as a religion, like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so everybody everywhere is asking the same basic questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Right? What is wrong with the world? And how can what is wrong with the world be made right? I mean, ultimately, those are the questions that people are wrestling with, that they're dealing with. And for Christians, we have this meta-narrative. creation, fall, redemption, consummation. For this religion, their worldview has an answer to those questions. And when it comes, for example, to America, not just America, but really all of the world, they answer the question, who am I? With I am my ethnicity and my race, right? Why am I here? They answer that with the oppressor-oppressed paradigm. What's wrong with the world? Well, the oppressor-oppressed paradigm, right? White people set things up in order to oppress people. How can what is wrong be made right? You have to do the work of anti-racism. And so they have their own cosmology. As you said, they have their own saints, say their names, right? They have their own martyrs. They have their own priesthood. I refer to it as ethnic Gnosticism, the idea that oppressed minorities have special access to truth that other people cannot access, which is why we have to elevate these voices and listen to them. They become our priesthood. It's very religious. And in fact, they use religious terms like America's original sin of racism, right? Ibram X. Kendi, in his proposed constitutional amendment, talks about dealing with America's original sin of racism. Jim Wallace's book, America's Original Racism, America's Original Sin. And then even in critical race theory, that second major premise is convergence theory, which is the idea that white people are incapable of righteous actions in the area of race unless their interests converge with those of people of color. And that term righteous action, that's not my term. That's their term. So it's very religious, which is one of the reasons that it sort of, piques the interest of Christians.
Right. Well, at the end of the day, people want to belong. They want to be a part of something important. They want to change the world. Yes. And so it's very appealing. If you don't have anything else that you belong to. I feel like we saw that a lot last year. If you didn't have a place where you felt like you were part of something important, well, this kind of fit that bill.
People who were scared to go assemble at their church went and assembled at the BLM rally.
Right. Right. Yeah. I guess last question, in terms of reading the other sources, on the one hand, I could say, well, your book is fantastic. Owen's new book is fantastic, but that's coming at it from one side of the conversation. Should we be nervous about reading some of the other voices in this conversation, or is it healthy to at least know where some of these ideas are coming from?
Well, but I think that's a misconception, right? Neither Owen nor I writing from a side, right? My book is not about a side, right, of the conversation. I'm dealing with this thing from top to bottom. And so what's interesting is people on the other side of this have been able to frame the discussion in terms that say a balanced view on this is a view that accepts at least the premises of critical race theory while using the word gospel. Well, that's not balanced at all. And so it's ironic that those individuals who have completely imbibed this, unbiblical ideology are seen as balanced, where individuals like Owen and myself and others who are trying to write about this from a biblical perspective and use the words of individuals who promote these ideas are seen somehow as not having balance.
Right.
I just reject that premise.
Yeah, I think it's easy to try to frame it that way, to say, well, this book's on that side, this one's on this other side, but it's all part of a conversation.
Yeah. For us, it's part of a conversation, but for them, it's not, because certain people got to shut up, right? Yeah.
I guess I'll throw in one last thing too. In terms of leaders, the average person in the pew, what's a person to do? I think there are a lot of people who kind of watch the news, watch what's trending on social media, and they throw their hands up. They're like, I'm afraid to be a part of this conversation. If I stick my head up, I'm going to be like the nail that gets hit with the hammer. So just for the average Christian out there, how do they be a part of this in a way that's productive and helpful?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think there are a number of things we have to do. The principle, and I write about this at the end of the book, is what Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 10, right? So we destroy arguments and lofty opinions raised against the knowledge of God, right? We have to do that. And we don't want to do that, right? Because the 11th commandment, thou shalt be nice. And we don't believe the other 10, right?
Yep.
And so the idea of destroying arguments and lofty opinions, we just think that that's not Christian, that's not nice. We got to get over that, right? We've got to understand what these things are. We've got to identify them, and we've got to destroy them. And then the second thing is we take every thought captive to obey Christ. So our thoughts about race, our thoughts about ethnicity, our thoughts about sexuality, our thoughts about reconciliation, our thoughts about history, all of those things have to be taken captive to obey Christ. So one of the things that I'm trying to do here is to give people tools to be able to really understand, evaluate, and talk intelligently about these ideas, to recognize those ideas that are, lofty opinions and arguments raised against the knowledge of Christ, and to lead to that practice of taking all these other thoughts captive to obey Christ. So I think we need to educate ourselves. I think we need to understand what's happening here. I think we need to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. But ultimately, we have to recognize that these things are at war with us, and we've got to fight.
All right. The book is Fault Lines. It is a must read. This conversation isn't going away. You need to be a part of it. You need to I was going to say pick a side. It's not pick a side. It's know how to effectively engage and really bring some truth, bring the gospel, and go about this in a way that's going to be helpful and productive. Don't just sit there and do nothing. I feel like that's what a lot of us did the past year and a half, and it hasn't been good. Voddie, an honor to talk with you. Thanks for sharing with the audience, man. I appreciate it.
Amen. Thank you. It's my pleasure.